Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Freedom International live stream. And I want to call this as the spring edition, just because we took a break for the whole month of March. And we just needed to do that. Sometimes you have a lot of conversation going on, and in your life, you just needed to take a step back and then reconnect with your family. And I did that. And I'm just happy that I traveled all the way to the Philippines, and now I can share you a little bit of what I have observed through my family and friends of what's been going on. And first, I'd like to welcome our guest, Matt Ehret. And thank you so much, Matt. And of course, my co host, Roy, from the Awakening podcast. And I welcome also John from the Podcasters Wellness Alliance. And thank you. And for those who didn't make it, because we're just restarting again, I hope and pray that they're in good health. So Matthew is a journalist and a co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation, and he's the editor-in-chief of Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at the American University of Moscow, and the BRI, and that's what it stands for, but stands for the, Matthew will correct me again with that, at the Belton Road Initiative. There you go. Belton Road Initiative, which is so crucial for each and every one of us to understand. Expert from Rogue News, and I love that Rogue News as well. So Matthew has published so many scientific articles with 21st Century Science and Technology, Nexus, Principia Scientifica, and a regular author in Strategic Culture, Washington Times, The Cradle and Global Research. And he really is a prolific writer and speaker, and he has all that untold history of Canada, different books, series, and then The Clash of Two Americas, which is really, it started volume 1, 2, and 3, and plus so many, especially when it comes to us understanding what's going on in the psyops for China or Russia, or who knows, maybe India will be added to that psyop. So who else? So our guest today is truly been one of my favorite to for me to get the real thing. Okay, although I always have to depend on my connection with the source, with God, to let me understand what's really going on. So I strongly recommend that you all be connected with Matthew. And and first, let me also thank my family and friends for letting me interrupt their busy lives and just seeing me, hugging them, listening to their voice, singing with them, eating with them the delicious food that I miss. I usually don't binge on Filipino food, even if there are stores in America, because there's nothing like eating with your family right in the Philippines. So thank you so much. And so for today's topic, I thought how to save a dying republic, which is been Matthew's latest series of articles in his Substack. And why I wanted to do that is because in these current times, we really need to know how. We need to know the steps, or how we can be engaged in our own little way and in a bigger way, so that we just don't end up just complaining about things. And in this series, I know that in the first part, it's now part 4 parts, but who knows, Matthew may add another part. So in the first part is that choosing what reality you live in. Part 2 is introducing Hamilton's American system, and part 3 is Lincoln and the Greenbacks, and the part 4 is John Quincy Adams and anti-imperial origins of the Monroe Doctrine. And so if you type in Matt Ehret, it's like boom, you get a lot of links. So it's only up to us, to you, to educate yourself. Don't let anyone educate you. You own that. You have to empower yourself. So Matthew, thank you. And let me just rest now, and I'll let you start in the lighter way, because I know you've been traveling. So please share us what you have observed in the different countries. What's your highlight? What's the joy that you saw? And what's the concern that you have experienced from different people?
Well, yeah, Grace, as always, thank you for this most generous of introductions. You really you put a lot of hats on my head, but I'll try to not make my neck break. But thank you very much. And indeed, the newest series of articles has emerged out of what I felt to be a bit of a need right now to clarify certain ambiguities in a point of high confusion, especially in the United States, which is going through a multitude of a perfect storm of sorts, where on the one hand, we have an economic collapse, which is many decades coming. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen, even with under Trump. It didn't happen under Obama. It didn't happen under COVID. It didn't happen under Bush. This has been something which you could say has been ongoing since really the murder of John F. Kennedy. And I think that that's a good inflection point in terms of the trajectory of the United States and the broader transatlantic world at large that had given so much to defeating the fascist Hitler project of the 1930s and 40s, which was originally intended to be the enforcement mechanism, fascism, of a new world order that didn't happen the way certain very powerful institutions in the city of London, in Wall Street, had wished that it unfolded. And a lot of people have been confused about that history. They don't understand what John F. Kennedy was invoking as he emerged on the scene, not by himself, but with a network of like-minded people within the institutions of America who recognized this fascist fifth column, today known as the deep state, that had been built up over many generations within the heart of the Washington establishment. Eisenhower warned about this on his outgoing speech. Little too little, too late for Eisenhower. But they don't know what JFK was invoking economically, politically, diplomatically, foreign policy-wise, in terms of his approach to fighting for the right for nations of Asia, India, Africa, South America to have access to full development, full spectrum economies, to remove the power of the Federal Reserve through initiating a government-directed form of economic policy. These things have been forgotten. They don't, and because of this lack of knowledge of our recent history, people don't know what Bobby Kennedy Sr. was fighting to invoke in 1968 when he was killed. It's accessible if you read Bobby Kennedy's Towards a Newer World, which was his sort of policy outline. But nobody reads it. It hasn't been republished since 1975, so nobody has access to, or they don't know how to look for the original writings of people who were making history and who were cut down before they could accomplish many of their tasks. So what happened was a coup, and our economy went through a fundamental and unnatural, perverse transformation in really you could say 1971. And so the book series that you outlined, The Clash of the Two Americas, from which I derive a lot of the content for my newest series of articles on preserving saving a dying republic, which has part 5 that just was released yesterday on The Last American Vagabond. It's sort of where I'm trying to give people a sense of, okay, who the enemy is, what is the importance of America and grand strategy from 1776 until the present, because again, it's not right to, even though the U.S. has done a lot of evil, I'd say most of the coups d'etats, assassinations of foreign government leaders over the past 80 years have been done, unfortunately, and through the United States, the CIA, the military industrial, Navy intelligence, other things, the FBI carrying out its own share of murder, including leaders within America itself, right? Fred Hampton, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, we mentioned a bunch. Despite that, people have forgotten how to focus on, okay, so what are the enemies of the Republic? What did the Republic originally break away from back in 1776, right? Very basic questions that we should have a deeper sense of importance. And with that sense, we could really, really firmly understand, well, what are the conditions at play today in the world as we go through a breakdown of the $1.2 quadrillion derivatives bubble, basically fictitious capital built around unpayable debts that have been metastasizing since the early 1970s, which will default. They can do not but default. That's what the current, whether it's personal debts, national debts, consumer, commercial debts, whatever that's been bundled, declared assets or equity inside of the banks that have been then gambled upon, insured upon, gambled upon, and then on top of that, called derivatives. All of that has been designed to blow. It's a weapon of mass economic destruction set up as a time bomb within the once former viable industrial economies of the West that have been hollowed out. Right, we've lost our ability to economically stand on our 2 feet, whether in Europe, Canada, the U.S., and so people don't have been led to believe that their enemy is China, or it's Russia, or some combination of China and Russia, or Venezuela. And I mean, the simplicity of thinking that has induced people to believe that those countries that are trying currently to survive the current storm and not kill off their people or destroy their ancient heritage on some altar, to believe that these cultures and nations are their enemy is the highest tragedy and folly. So I'm trying to clarify, well, what is this oligarchy thing? What is this thing that's been running these international deep states around the world and have been trying to do what they failed to do in 1945, which is get a one world government under a fascist technocratic policy to enforce a depopulation program. That's what was attempted due to patriots in America and other nations, but primarily America. That was thwarted. And today, again, we have a reawakening of that, what I identify in my article series as the American system of political economy, the thing that 8 American presidents died while in office fighting for. Again, not taught in history books, but all 8 American presidents who died while in office were invoking the exact same system. So I'm trying to clarify, well, what is that system? How does it work? Now, to get back to your question on my world travels, and you and I were both traveling around the same time. I find that interesting. Just to be quick, yeah, I went to, my wife and I were invited to speak at 2 freedom events, one in Ireland for a Think Local event hosted by Sarah Haboubi, who is an activist, a teacher, and has developed a really powerful network of collaborators. And she organized a very interesting conference dealing with banking, agriculture, and energy. John Waters spoke alongside us, as did Catherine Austin Fitz and a variety of others. Alex Craner, our good buddy, flew in as well to speak. So that was great. We had about 250 guests in the live audience, and God knows how many more streaming. And just the amount of hunger and thirst for not just the practical, how do we preserve our local communities and family from the oncoming economic collapse, but like that was obviously very high. That's why people were there. But there was a real desire to understand the global context, because I've spoken at various events like this in the past. I've watched them, and there's a tendency for people to, when they're in a state of fear, to think purely myopically local, right? And say and go for this, what I believe is a trap, which is I just can take care of my little, preppers. Let's just say that, preppers. I gotta just build my bunker, have my emergency food, maybe have like a mini network, and have a little, local mini economy. And that's how I'm going to like survive with my family. And okay, that's fine. We should think about those things. I'm not saying don't think about having spare food and other things like that. Do that. But at the expense of thinking about the top-down chemistry shaping our world, that's where it becomes a problem. And I think a lot of people find themselves getting sucked into divide and conquer tactics, because frankly, in my assessment, it's going to be a lot easier to cut people up and destroy them with the powers of the military and the state if they all disengage into little microorganisms, which in this case in Ireland, that was not a problem. There was a very deep hunger to understand the difference in paradigm of banking, of political economy that is emerging in Eurasia, how this could change the dynamics in which we're operating in the West. As you could very quickly imagine Russia, India, China, other countries which are currently setting up an alternative economic architecture, break away from some of these multinational institutions, which would completely change the rules of the game very quickly and give us opportunities that we don't normally have. So there was a lot of discussion like that in that Irish conference. We had a conference in Basel in Switzerland, which was a full day event. It was 2 days actually, with hosted by Kern Punkt and our good friend Kirsten Ewell. Daniela Ganzer was a speaker, as was Dirk Pollmann, an award-winning journalist and filmmaker. Daniel Ganzer is the guy who did probably the best work on do you guys know Operation Gladio or Daniela Ganzer's work? Okay, he's a cool guy. Anybody listening online right now should Google Daniela Ganzer. And he did some of the most pioneering work identifying the Nazi and Italian fascist networks that were incorporated into MI6, the CIA, after World War II as part of the war against communism, which also was behind the growth of a lot of terrorist organizations like the Weather Underground, like the Red Brigades, like you had these things in the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, killing statesmen like Enrico Mattei, like Dag Hammarskjöld, just running general terrorist operations against the population, including in Quebec too, throughout the 1960s, 70s. This is all part of a strategy of general terror to get the population to run into the embrace of captured governments that were being taken under the control of those same fascists that they'd formerly fought to stop. That's been the last story of our 60, 70 past years. So Daniel Ganzer blew the whistle off of that. He spoke. Another 250, 300 people showed up for the live event in Switzerland. So again, a lot of allies, a lot of great minds, and the focus on that event was really bridging the broken bridge, or rebridging the divide between East and West, which is currently being set up as part of a broader preparation for war against Russia and China that's been ongoing. And then the last phase of our journey was working for about 2 weeks on a project with another grouping of friends in Japan, who are also very concerned that Japan is being used as a U.S. Military colony, which it has been since we bombed the hell out of Japan back in 1945. It's not like the American military disappeared and let Japan become a free country. It still has 50,000 U.S. troops occupying it, and it's still being used as part of a broader frontal preparation for war against China, with largely puppet regimes in power. So the population of Japan is obviously a bit confused, not happy to be caught in the crossfire of a nuclear war, but they don't really know what to do. So our friend who had an idea of a sort of cultural project to create a series of videos educating Westerners, including Japanese, on what is really going on was the topic of that time. And it was beautiful because it was April 1st that we found ourselves there in the cherry blossom season. It's 2 weeks of cherry blossoms that inaugurates the new year in a sense. So there was a lot of life, a lot of vitality, and it was a good time to be in Japan. A lot of raw fish.
Well, thank you, Matt, for sharing that, and thank you for your opening information and knowledge, because it's truly important that other countries, especially like for me, having just visited the Philippines, that my people understand that what's happening in U.S. has been affecting the fate of our republic in the Philippines, and so it's crucial. And just like you, I met families and members who the first thing they make comments is about, it's China, it's Russia, and never really seeing that. Even if I mention about US, but first I also want them, just like in health, that the healing starts from within. So if our country, the Philippines or US, usually stop looking outside, but look what's going on in the vicinity, political, economic, because maybe that's the solution is coming there. Then, of course, you tie it, as you said, to the macro level. So thank you. And I'm sure Roy and John has a lot of questions brewing and comments, so I'll pass it on to them.
Sure.
Hi, Matt. It's great getting you back again.
Hey, Ray.
So you mentioned actually about the 1st of April in Japan, and what I'm seeing is there's a lot of people kind of stating that that's when the new year kind of started. I know it's kind of gone on a little tangent, but everything they do to us is they've changed everything. So I hear that there was originally 13 months and that the year began in April. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean that's something that as far as I know, I'm not an expert, but I think that we once had the new year under the Julian calendar used to be celebrated on April 1st. That was for centuries and centuries. It was April 1st is the new year people would celebrate. And then you had due to certain, well, I haven't looked into it, but due to certain astronomical observations, things were falling a little bit out of whack. There wasn't an ability to sort of maintain the calendar system in proper accord with the changing of the seasons, and certain remixes were made under what was called the Gregorian remix that modified the new year and chose to make it January 1st instead of April 1st. And the whole idea of April Fools was actually, it emerges with this confusion because a lot of people were refusing to change their traditional time that they celebrated the new year, and they're like, I'm not going to just stop doing what my family has been doing for centuries. And they continue to celebrate the new year on April 1st. And the church, in order to try to like get them back in line, was calling them all like the April Fools, or the Fools of April, because they're not stepping back into conformity. Beyond that, I don't really know about other details. No,
excellent. So, I mean, we're looking at all the confusion in the world, and I mean, the fact that you went to Ireland. I mean, I follow the politics there because being Irish, even though I'm living in Poland, and I can just see that they've destroyed the country. And like, because you watch the politics of everywhere, of say 5 countries, is there any that haven't been bought and aren't controlled? That you would think, we think
the transatlantic is a pretty tough spot right now. You obviously have places where and Ireland it's tragic what's happened to Ireland, considering their rebellious and very noble historical heritage. Ireland was the only place that really stood up firmly against the Lisbon Treaty originally back in 2007, which set the tone for the European parliamentary dictatorship.
That was one I remember because we voted no, and it was the wrong answer, so we had to vote again. And there was a few decent politicians that were out there, and I think it was something like a 4,000-page document. And it was like nobody was reading it. They were just doing what they were told. And I remember seeing that going, this is dangerous, how this is actually being done.
Oh, yeah. No, that was wild. And I think at the time, Sinn Féin was not completely captured yet. There was still a lot of nationalists who didn't want to sacrifice their society, who had rallied around Sinn Féin, around Gerry Adams, who unfortunately has, stepped down in 2018. And since then, you've had a bunch of Council on Foreign Relations, CIA-connected puppets who have been put in that place of the Resistance Party. The point was made to me quite clearly while I was in Ireland that the new approach of the Resistance Party of Sinn Féin against the establishment government policy is to basically just criticize the government policy for whatever it's doing by saying it's not doing enough of it, and demanding that you do the same thing, but then like about double. And acting like now all of a sudden you're anti-establishment. It's whether it's on COVID lockdowns, whether it's on anti-Russian policies, whatever it is, you just double down on that. So there's not the sufficient representation, obviously, representing the interests of the people or nation in the Irish political system. And I don't have really a sense of what to do about that at this moment, except to say, as I would for any country, it's up to the people to organize themselves in a more rational, moral, and competent way than they have formerly been doing, because too many people have fallen into the habit of looking for heroes to come in and sweep in and save them. And of course, I believe in the great human being idea of history, that history is shaped by great people looking within themselves for the courage and knowledge and competence to intervene on a tragic process. That's why I always refer back to John F. Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy. So there are heroic personalities. I'm not saying that there aren't, but at the same time, some of those people, those attributes can only happen because we find the hero inside of us too. and we break from our bad habits of thinking, of feeling, and we become bigger than we thought we could be, and organize processes that we should have been doing, which is, again, like a lot of people have been wasting their time. Especially that was one of the worst things of COVID. There's so many bad things about the so-called pandemic, but I think one of the most damaging things is that it deflected people away from the sorts of things they should have been doing to prepare themselves, building town hall meetings, organizing properly for really a real intervention into their governments based on grand strategy. That didn't really happen. Instead, people went into survival mode, that has hurt us. It hurt the resistance movement quite a bit. That being said, you asked about any governments that are not captured. Yeah, to varying degrees. The transatlantic is, like I said, in probably the worst place that it's ever been. Finland just joined NATO. Dear God, like that's insane. NATO is already. I'm not going to bash NATO. Everyone should know why NATO is evil. If they don't, you got to do some work. But I would say the places where I see a much better job at de-weeding their deep state gardens, so to speak, is in Eurasia. I see actual serious evidence of a fight from the leadership and of Russia, of China, increasingly of India. As you pointed out, it's thus likely that India is going to be painted as a supervillain at some point soon. So we should prepare ourselves mentally for that the psyops that will emerge to convince us that India is bad, and we have to also go to war with India. I'm pretty sure the Australians are going to get heavy doses of that, and New Zealanders. They are, after all, the military bases of the United States to engage in any such war, just as the Japanese are in Japan's backyard, or the Taiwanese. South America, increasingly, I've seen some pretty good speeches from President Obrador, who's made some very powerful moves to take control of the national oil interests of Mexico, while at the same time building some serious strategic bridges with China, as well as other Ibero-American countries in the face of the oncoming economic collapse that they've moved in a certain good way. Brazil has done certain things that at first I was a little bit demoralized, seeing some of the creeps coming in with Lula da Silva. But at the same time, it seems like Lula was biding his time a little bit, dealing with the insane factors that he has to deal with in Brazil. And when the moment that is ripe has come to pluck the fruit, he's taken it and has made a pretty good move towards breaking out of U.S. dollar hegemony, settling transactions and trade between Brazil and China in yuan, as well as firmly moving to try to create a basis for a different economic currency for Ibero-America to trade and invest amongst themselves instead of relying on the U.S. dollar. A lot of African countries as well have increasingly found the courage. 40 countries of Africa met with Vladimir Putin, or met with their Russian counterparts at the Africa-Russia summit, March 19th, 20th, 21st. That was a very important summit. About 40 different trade and economic and military agreements were reached. And this is the point when Putin was made the International Criminal Court most wanted political figure to be arrested. And that was done for a variety of reasons, but one of the big reasons was to intimidate those African leaders that were going to be meeting up with their Russian counterparts, to say, well, don't meet with them. They're run by a villain who's got a warrant out on his head. But despite that, 40 of the 55 African countries still met with him and signed massive agreements, including Sudan, which agreed to set up a military port with Russia on the port of Sudan on the Red Sea.
And just to interject on that, because I heard recently, I don't know, it's very hard for me to actually validate it, that there's, of the 50 states in Africa, that the American have military bases in 49 of them.
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. I saw some maps featuring U.S. military bases that would corroborate what you just said.
Which is kind of like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah. No, it's bad. I mean, I'm about to do a podcast with an Ethiopian radio station in a couple of hours, and we're going to talk about Ethiopia a lot. which is sort of the most rebellious and independent-minded African country that's never been colonized. There's been so many attempts to colonize Ethiopia, all of which have failed, all the way up to Mussolini's Italy and beyond. And they're making some of the strongest moves to working with Russia and China, especially in support of their ability to develop high-speed rail, the Addis Ababa to Djibouti railway, which now could easily transform to becoming a bridge across, or a tunnel. I'm not sure which, across the. There's a small gap from Djibouti if you go on the Horn of Africa to Yemen into the Gulf states. That's about 28 kilometers. Not an impossible distance as far as a tunnel or a bridge that could extend this rail that's been developed by the Chinese primarily across into Yemen as part of a broader reconstruction of both Yemen, but also of bringing in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the other Gulf states ever more into the Belt and Road paradigm, which is a paradigm not based on speculating on money or debt, but rather using the creation of productive credit for investments into real infrastructure, building up the real economy, creating abundance.
Is that why there's so much kind of conflict in the Horn of Africa and Yemen? Because I hear so much going on there. It's basically control of that kind of port.
Yeah, that's been the big thing. Like there was back in 2007, 8, and 9 when Gaddafi was moving ahead really fast with building the Great Man-Made Water Project, funded by the Libyan dinar. I think it's dinar, I want to say, but also that was being done with primarily Mubarak's Egypt and President Bashir of Sudan. So you had a trifecta of African countries, all working on a breakaway economic strategy based on real development. And again, the Gaddafi program for tapping into some of the deep water reservoirs under the Sahara and bringing that to the surface was known as the eighth wonder of the world for good reason. That was all happening at the same time that you had in Ethiopia and Djibouti and Yemen, as well as Saudi Arabia, a discussion from the business community and certain politicians to do what I just said, the building up of this project that would have a sister city on both sides of the Red Sea, major advanced megacities. I forgot the name all of a sudden, but that would then be the connecting between an actual high-speed rail network, and momentum was moving ahead on this pretty fast until the Arab Spring, which was a Western-funded color revolution that overthrew first Mubarak, right? We all know about the Muslim Brotherhood and how they were used as proxies to overthrow the government of Egypt. And then we saw the same policy first in Tunisia, then Egypt, then Libya was destroyed by NATO, using, of course, Al-Qaeda operatives that we were told were freedom fighters, as they always do. And then they did the same thing to Syria, which didn't go as planned because of Russia's intervention primarily. And then also Susan Rice, the Rhodes Scholar under Obama, who's still there under Biden, was in charge of carving up Sudan into a north and a south component, one being Southern Christian, the other being Northern Muslim, as part of a new Balkanization of Russia to break up that momentum, which happened. President Bashir of Sudan was also given the honor of being on the the International Criminal Court's criminal list, where a warrant was put out on his head for his arrest to legitimize what Susan Rice had then later done, which was carve up the country into two. So that put the brakes on a lot of this momentum. But now it's coming back because of China having organized really brilliantly with also the Russians, things that we've seen miraculously emerge, like this entente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, delegations of which are both meeting today again in Beijing. Or no, yesterday they met in Beijing to solidify this program of healing all of the wounds of the past decades and bringing a cooperative policy against two arch enemies, right, of the Middle East into harmony. And Saudi Arabia has jumped on board with this the Belt and Road Initiative, because they've come to realize, I think, overall, that despite the fact that they were rewarded over many decades since World War II for being Wahhabite sponsors of terrorism, money launderers of all sorts of things, as part of the oil economy that was used to smash the world into conformity, they were ultimately flushable. At the end of the day, they're expendable. and you just look at the discussions at Davos, in the city of London around, the idea of a post-carbon economy, of a depopulated world order of people eating bugs and living off of solar panels, which is just insane. Saudi Arabia kind of, I think, at a certain point realized, well, wait a minute, we don't seem to play much of a role in the equation of what they want to bring online post-economic collapse, which is a post-carbon world. Their whole economy is carbon, right? So I think they were ultimately persuaded that they should go with a new set of rules, and because of that, and that stability that can now finally emerge, since Iran is, a big supporter of the Yemeni Houthis. There's now a final chance for some real large-scale infrastructure investments that could rehabilitate this program of building rail pipelines, other things between the Gulf and the African continent, and as well the Tigray People's Liberation Army. These, which in my assessment are completely U.S. aid, CIA proxies to destabilize Ethiopia. That's part of the northern Ethiopian region, is Tigray. The head of the World Health Organization himself is the brother of a leading Tigray terrorist, who himself Tedros has exhibited a lot of support over the years for the Tigray. Again, these are people who have carried out serious terrorists using child soldiers, other things, to run destabilization operations against Ethiopia. And he's been rewarded for his tasks by becoming, Gates's little peon at the WHO. But that's been resolved, or not totally, but I mean, there was huge steps that have resolved that conflict and created a basis of reconstruction and reconciliation there, despite the U.S. arsonists trying to light fires again and again. So yeah, there's a lot of reason to hope that domain can actually see some real development soon.
And because there's so many people, they're feeling defeated because they see there's no accountability. And lately, Oxford, I think there's a lot of places they're bringing in the kind of 15-minute cities and everything. And it's like, what's their plan with that? It's like just to kind of, and I don't know which are travels, but where I'm living in Poland, half the city is basically under construction with maybe 3 people working there. And that seems to be the norm going along everywhere as well. Which in turn makes people frustrated, angry, which bring it home, which makes removes the creative ability and the ability to kind of fight, because it sucks the energy out of you. Are you seeing that in a lot of the places you've been around, Joe?
Oh yeah, that's a universal constant, I think. Yeah, I obviously with the 15-minute cities, I think all of you guys already did your homework. I think most audience members listening to your show have done their homework. They know what this is. And at the end of the day, there's the oligarchy is many things, but creative is not one of them. And I think the thing about this 15-minute city program is it's not something that they cooked up over the last few months or years. It's something that's been on the books as a desirable component of a broader technocratic world government regime that would be based upon a highly Balkanized society, right? When I say Balkanized, I'm referring now to the period of the dismantling of Yugoslavia in the 90s, the carving up of the former Soviet space into micro ethno-nationalist regions that would thereby be more easily manageable because they're divided, and also more easily set at each other's throats because they're based upon their individual class prejudices and other things, or ethno prejudices that could then be nurtured by handlers who manage the mythologies of, let's say, the greater Albanians, who have a sort of mythos of a much more expanded Albanian territory, or we see it with the greater Finland ideologues that have a romanticized view of that Finland should actually be like 4 times greater in size than it currently is today, based on certain myths of deep Nordic history, which was capitalized upon by the Nazi collaborators in Finland back, like Mannerheim, who was a leading Finnish general and a collaborator with the Nazis back in the 1930s and 40s. There was a whole these are all things that have been that the oligarchy likes to cultivate, because they know that if you get a bunch of countries who are neighboring each other, who all have ideological, cultural commitments to expand their territory over their neighbors' borders, that's a perfect recipe for creating perpetual war and conflict. And better to manage the chaos, that way, if people are too busy fighting each other than realizing that they have the common enemy, starting fires on both sides. So the 15-minute cities is part of that idea of just getting people to be more in a controlled environment. It fits in with the central bank digital currency idea as well, of giving us all like limited credits for universal basic income, because obviously there's not going to be jobs for everybody, but you don't want to say, well, we're heartless, we're going to let a bunch of people just die. No, you don't say it that way, but you will say you want that outcome if you're an oligarch. So you'll say, well, we'll just give everybody equal amounts of credits independent of whether they're working or not, as long as their behavior is matching up to certain protocols that we demand, be followed. And part of that will probably involve the privilege of visiting family that's more than 15 minutes away in your rental car that, you might be able to access with your credits if you're doing the right things, or recycling whatever, not using as much of a carbon footprint as you're expected to. All that to say, this goes back to the 1950s, 60s as far as part of the formula. But as I said, they're not creative. They're still using the same script they put online generations ago that they thought they were going to get with no challenge back in 1991, 92, when the Soviet Union melted down. And despite the fact that over the last, especially decade, the world has shifted to demonstrate a real resistance of nations representing, I would say, like over 75% of the world population that don't want to go along with this, they're still doubling down on that same 1950s program formula. And so I don't think it can work in that context. I think the greatest threat we have is not so much the 15-minute cities as much as it is the danger of nuclear war, which is probably the only thing I could see right now that could fully upset a victory, a longer-term victory on the part of humanity against this oligarchy, is a nuclear war being launched. That could derail things. But I don't think that they necessarily have the ability to achieve that totalitarian fascist formula that they've so desired for so long. I don't think that they can do that.
Okay. And just before I pass you to John there, because it's something that I saw, because I've heard of people saying they don't believe that they have the nuclear bombs. I know that because I've actually wrote about it myself, that there was like 5,000 tests and everything. But when I saw pictures, I don't know, was it Nagasaki or Hiroshima? But basically, Americans had went in and bombed it, that there was nothing there anyway. And I saw pictures of that. And there's no kind of pictures of around that. So I'm not sure. I mean, that's just something. Was it a fair tactic that's done to just put people into the fair mode again?
Oh, well, I think that there definitely were crazy firebombs that did completely decimate whole cities, no doubt. I'm of the view that that nuclear bombs do exist, but at the same time, when I look at the type of hypersonic technology that's been brought online, I mean, Vladimir Putin first unveiled a new generation of defensive weaponry to respond to the threat of a provoked nuclear attack by NATO. And he did this first in 2000, and I believe it was 18. And he basically it was a big shock and surprise to many Western geopoliticians who thought that they still had the technological lead on Russia because of what they did to Russia in the 1990s. The US, the CIA pretty much had an office inside of Russia's military high command in the 1990s under Yeltsin. And they really, really tore down Russia's military. And so there was still that sense of hubristic victory. And so when Putin unveiled this new generation of hypersonic missiles, drones that could travel like around the world twice, and I'm talking hypersonics that go like 15 to 20 times faster than the speed of sound, like crazy things. It really broke the formula of mutual assured destruction. And the whole mutual assured destruction formula was always based on the idea of Bertrand Russell and the planners at Pugwash back in 1958, that both sides, because a nuclear war could not necessarily be guaranteed to be won as an old school conventional war. They were like, well, we have to just always maintain parity of both sides of the Iron Curtain, and we'll have this mutual balance of terror. Now, that's a perfect formula for an oligarchy to keep all sides in a state of absolute confrontation and paranoia, where you could just look at the damage that was done to both sides of the world, right, during the Cold War is wild. And if one side gets a technological edge, we have to ensure that the other side gets a technological edge, right? And just keep that. Now, that's not a real good secure policy either. There were moments where, in hindsight, we can look back and we could see that there were like at least 4 or 5 different occasions, at least, where commands to launch nuclear weapons based on a misreading of a military exercise was given to nuclear submarine commanders, and the submarine commanders, like in the case of the Soviet hero, forgot his name all of a sudden, he refused to follow his orders. But had he followed his orders and he had the nuclear codes, he could have launched, a full-blown nuclear assault on America, which would have then involved everybody shooting everything they had, which would have been hugely, that could have set humanity back thousands of years. So today, that formula was broken by the Russians, who basically said, look, as much as you think you can launch a first strike attack on us, on Moscow and all of the major cities, and think that you're going to come out victorious, these technologies prove that no matter what you do to us, we can do 10 times more to you in response that will evade all of your defensive mechanisms. So give up on that agenda that was, begun under the expansion of NATO in the 1990s. Just give up. And he gave many alternatives that would be much more palatable for humanity, which we've chosen. Donald Trump was the only one who had political power who tried to work with the Russians on some of these ententes. That didn't last too long. And they've shared and they've worked with the Chinese as well. So the Chinese have the same hypersonic response technologies. So I don't think that a nuclear war would necessarily be, some people say it would be the elimination of all life, human and other, on Earth forever. I don't think that it's that apocalyptic, but it would be bad, I believe. And it'd be devastatingly bad. I think we could probably, Russia and China have demonstrated a capacity to eliminate a lot of the missiles that would attack them, but not all of them. And, again, it would set us back hundreds, if not thousands of years. I wouldn't want to entertain that if it could be avoided.
Okay.
But yeah, I do believe that there's nuclear bomb technology. I do
okay. Listen, thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, Matt. I have to pass you on to John. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Hey, man.
So I've been trying to enable my VPN, so I have to be very careful. The CRTC might cancel me. So no, I'm not going to be talking about Canadian politics or Nazis or stuff like that, which I wanted to, but I do want to touch up on a couple of things. You said something about the Balkans. Now, I'm from Greek descent. I follow Greek politics very closely, more closely actually than Canadian and American politics. So I know exactly what you're talking about. When Yugoslavia fell and it got broken apart, and I know how intrusive the American CIA is with foreign governments, because there was one Greek politician who was trying to remove himself from, remove not himself, but the country of Greece from the European Union. And there were multiple attacks, assassination attempts on his life. He never wants to set foot in politics again. His predecessor gave the name Macedonia to what we know as Northern Macedonia now. Albania, we've seen in Greece multiple different maps where Albania's borders go right down towards the Corinthian Gulf. The Macedonian borders brushing up against Athens. Turkish borders engulfing Athens. And now our current government, in Greece, has proposed that half the Aegean belongs to Turkey. So there's, and they're actually going to be in an election this month in Greece. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting. A lot of people are thinking that the current government's going to retain power because Greeks have just lost hope which is wrong. They shouldn't lose hope. But anyways, so I know exactly what you're talking about when it comes to the Balkans. It's complete. It's a complete mess down there.
Mm.
It's an absolute mess. My my first question is about BRICS for you.
Mm.
Now that BRICS is starting to gain a foothold in the world stage, and they're, like you said before, they're creating, they created peace in the Middle East. Pretty much they created peace in the Middle East. Where do you see the American dollar in comparison to that? Now that yuan is going to be traded, going to be used to trade for oil.
Yeah, the U.S. dollar is going to collapse. I'm quite persuaded that the U.S. dollar is not long for this world in that sense, and that's not necessarily a good thing, since a lot of lives are going to suffer, are going to be put in jeopardy with the collapse of that dollar, especially in the part of the world where we happen to live, most of us. So I mean, so I don't say that with happiness, but there is a certain lawfulness to the U.S. dollar collapsing, because at the end of the day, you can only engage in economic terrorism and tyranny for so long without paying the repercussions. And I think that that's a sign that the universe is a just and lawful universe, that it won't tolerate evil and immorality indefinitely. And I do hope that the U.S. has the moral capacity to organize a proper change in policy before that, or at least maybe they need to have a bit of a kick in the ass, the way the Americans who became decadent in the 1920s under the Roaring '20s of easy money. There were a good 30 years between the assassination of McKinley in 1901 and the blowout of the economic system in 1929. That was 30 years of relative consistent decay in the minds, the morals, the physical economy of America, despite the small attempt by Warren Harding to revive the Lincoln Republican tradition in 1921, 22, and then he dies in 23 by oyster poisoning. But so despite his small little attempt, there was still a general decline in the minds and morals of the people. So did they need to have a bit of a reality slapdown? I personally, unfortunately, think they kind of did, to be shaken out of their dream state, their drunken sort of fervor. Did it have to be the way it was? I don't think anything had to be the way it was, but that 4 year of pain of Great Depression created a responsiveness in the people who began to appreciate for the first time what real value was. They were confused before that. When times were stable, there was an apparent abundance, but it was an illusion. And then afterwards, there was an ability for the McKinley, Warren Harding networks to rally. In this case, it was around Franklin Roosevelt, and the Patriots were able to derail some of the world government programs that were being pushed to create a fascist economic solution a la Mussolini or Hitler in America in 1932-33. So that Roosevelt solution involved breaking up the banks, sending hundreds of leading bankers around JP Morgan to prison, sabotaging the London World Government Conference in 1933 in June, which was that was, again, for people who, I wrote a book on this, but there was a whole program to create a Bank of International Settlements, Bank of England-led world government to solve the global, economic crisis. So that needed the U.S. to be a part of that program, and Franklin Roosevelt sabotaged it by pulling the U.S. delegation out of all of the conference and torpedoed it. So that bought the world some time to rebuild, to get some infrastructure back online, to start bringing some of these criminals under a leash again, who had run roughshod over America under Coolidge, under President Hoover before that. So today, in today's Western decadent population, I mean, the unfortunate thing I'm quite sure of is that the people today are we're suffering a multi-generational delusion, a corruption of values. The minds and morals have probably gotten a lot worse than they were even in the decadence of the 20s. So that I think does require that we get our ass kicked by a bit of reality. The repercussions of our mistakes have to sort of bite a little bit. But I think that there is a need with that to introduce some viable solutions. And I'm here referring to the only thing viable in America that I see is the MAGA component of the Republican Party, who have exhibited, in my mind, any moral fitness to survive. There's nothing cultural beyond that's outside of that faction of the American population or political class that has the ability to renew America back towards its proper traditions. Which is, again, the reason why I'm putting out my series of articles right now to clarify, well, what is this American constitutional banking tradition that they don't teach about in school anymore? As far as the BRICS are concerned, the president of Kenya delivered a sharp speech about a week and a half ago, where he basically warned all of the investors in Kenya, you got about 2 weeks to get your money out of US dollars. And if you're still stuck in US dollars, I'm sorry, you're surely going to take some losses. He's not stupid. I mean, there's been a very long-term, very, very sophisticated back channel discussion in preparation for, and we're seeing it now, in preparation for a de-dollarization. India is settling their trade with the Chinese as well as with the Russians in local currencies. The ASEAN countries as well have moved forward very quickly at settling their trade in local ASEAN nations' currencies, primarily with the yuan, of course, because that is the strongest, stablest currency of the world. Latin American CELAC countries, Caribbean, Latin American nations as well have been moving in that direction. So yeah, I think that the BRICS originally might have, and I hear people who tell me, oh, Matt, you're a fool, because don't you know the BRICS is a Goldman Sachs project from 2001? It's like, yeah, of course. It was, yes, the BRIC was that. And it was originally designed to be a giant speculative biodiesel boondoggle run by Santander, with a trap of getting the developing world into a cage that would be tied to a speculative commodity that would be able to be burst by those controlling the biofuel speculative markets. Again, Santander has a lot of assets in Brazil. Brazil was the weak link that was designed to blow it all out. And that's why I, back in 2007, 2008, 2009, I was attacking the BRIC, because that's what it was. There was no evidence that it was anything but that. And then starting around 2011, 2012, when South Africa was brought in and it became the BRICS with an S, something changed. The policy, the entire way of thinking about value strategy coming out of these nations exhibited a qualitative change. And what happened is they went off the reservation. They played a certain game patiently. And when they were able to develop a capacity, certain muscles and capacities were built up, they began to all of a sudden move outside of the formula that was expected that they follow. So now what we're seeing is still a fight. There are still Western deep state interests that have way too much influence inside of things like the BRICS Development Bank, which was brought online in 2014. It hasn't really done very much. Way too much Green New Deal type of infrastructure, which is nasty. Too much of that, but it's changing. The Asian Infrastructure Development Bank is another powerful instrument, but it hasn't been used the way it could be. And I think some of these things might only be able to fulfill their potential as issuers of real international productive credit in a positive way, if the US dollar is not sort of holding everybody's necks underwater. So that's a component of it too. But looking at the general intention and new trajectory, I'm seeing that there is a resistance towards depopulation, a desire to create abundance, which is very different from the West. These are all indicators that the type of digital currencies you see being discussed in Asia versus the types of digital currencies you see being discussed by Davos creeps is two different universes. They're different paradigms. And a digital currency, I have this discussion ongoing with Whitney Webb. She's convinced that anybody who supports a digital currency is intrinsically evil, part of the Great Reset agenda. I'm of the view that a digital currency may or may not be bad. It's like I see it more of as a neutral thing that's shaped, its goodness or evilness is shaped by the intentions and ideas of who animates it to use it for what purpose and design. And what's your idea of humanity? Is humanity just a beast to be controlled by zookeepers, or machines to be programmed by programmers? Or do you see humanity as something more than beast or machine, or some combo of the two, which I believe the Eurasian leadership, with their Confucian, Christian, deeper Muslim traditions, is has a sensibility of the human being as a creative, sacred thing. I shouldn't say thing. That's such a denigrating thing. A species that is actually a good species, that's creative, that's the source of value. So I'm seeing a lot of that. So,
well,
yeah.
even the Christian view is actually more in line with that view. It's just the leaders that we have currently in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy is skewed. That's the best way that I could explain it.
Very diplomatic way of explaining it.
Yeah. I have a friend who was in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he told me Canada is one of the most underrated militaries in the world, and I agree with him with some of the conversations that I've had. And it's hard for me to imagine that Russia, after the collapse, would have gotten rid of all their nuclear armament. I mean, here's this two bullies on the playground, America and Russia. Okay, back in the 60s and 70s. You had these two bullies on the playground. Both are threatening to kill each other. And all of a sudden in the 90s, the Russian bully goes away. We're to believe that the Russian bully goes away. And they're going to say, yeah, we're going to give up all of our defenses. It's like logically thinking, like, I'm not good. If I'm threatening somebody's house, I'm expecting a repercussion. And if I move away from that environment, I'm going to leave. I'm going to get rid of all my weapons too. You know what I mean? It's so hard to believe that Russia, who was potentially more ahead in mass destruction than what America was. America had the dollar. They had nuclear warhead. They had nuclear warheads. I'm not going to say that they didn't. And they had the intel. And Russia had the exact same with the KGB, with their nuclear and thermonuclear programs. For them to get rid of it, it's hard for me to. It's hard for me to believe.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think for me, I find it very liberating to review my reality and my history from the standpoint of rejecting the popular narrative that we're told in school. You know, if we want to be respectable historians or journalists or just whatever, we're told that we have to abide by certain assumptions, which is number one, that history is shaped by nation states. And that alone is all that we have to think about, is nation states that want what do nation states want? They want more for themselves. They want their natural selfishness will naturally encroach upon their neighbors' territories, which will naturally induce wars, which is a natural state of affairs in a Hobbesian world of each against all. And the only way to break out of that natural cycle of constant war is for some Leviathan to be created, a la Hobbes, to impose order from the top. You know, Immanuel Kant has his own variety of a world government imposing some Kantian, categorical imperative of good behavior onto the chaotic, bubbling world of selfish chaos that is all humans are. Because a nation state is just the expression of the sum total of the selfish impulses of each selfish beast, right? In this Darwinian world of diminishing returns. And it's just this terrible formula that completely ignores any law, like dignified metaphysical reality of God, soul, justice, freedom, like all of these beautiful good things that give rise to the best of humanity. It's not, it doesn't fit with this popular imperial pattern, which we're expected to adapt in our minds. Now, the reality is there's oligarchical systems that have been maintaining continuous tradition and modes of causal, they're sitting in a causal nexus in world history above nation states going back thousands of years. I mean, read Plato's dialogues. Like look at the stories of the geopolitics of ancient Athens. And it wasn't just Athens fighting Persia or Athens fighting, like, what was the Delian League all about in the first place, right? The Delian League was originally set up in a noble way to unify the interests of all the different Greek people around defending themselves and their heritage against the Persian hordes. And at a certain point, why did it collapse? Well, it collapsed for a variety of reasons. It wasn't just that Athens went all renegade and just started stabbing its neighbors in the back, though there was a little bit of that going on. But you had the infusion of sophists, right? The cult of Delphi. You had these various intelligence operations that were masquerading as these oracles and these cults that would then gather intelligence, because all of the generals and kings from every part of the world were going to these Apollonian oracles saying, well, what do I do? Here's my money. Tell me what the gods tell me. Should I go to war? Should I make peace? And, all sides, enemies are coming to the same source, asking for what they should do. Now, the source is part of a network of nodes stretching all the way through the Babylonian world, all the way across, Athens, with different branches. And they're sharing information, and they're able to then be in a very, very strategic position to coordinate strategic wars and tell people, well, no, you should make an alliance with Sparta against blah, blah, blah. You should do whatever. And they're able to then divide and conquer in a very easy way while making a huge profit too. Because that doped up priestess is she's blubbering out random mutterings because she's on drugs. And and these priests are able to just interpret whatever to their victim general that they want to subvert or use for their own puppet making thing. So all that to say, you have this oligarchy which has used very similar techniques over the course of, and also I should also add to the sophists, right? The infusion of sophists that then brainwash the young aristocrats, the elites. And anybody could get training from a sophist to learn the arts of persuasion and rhetoric with no concern about truth for a price. And that was also corrupting the intelligentsia of Athens in a bad way, resulting in Athens going into never-ending wars and things like that subvert, like what happened to America in many ways after World War II. America brought in a bunch of sophists into their educational system, and they started stabbing in the back their former allies that they worked like brothers with. We're coming on to Elba Day, where American and Russian soldiers were met at the Elba River after defeating, as a sign of the defeat of Hitler. All of a sudden, the common sacrifices that you had made, I see that kind of like the Athens and the Spartans fighting together, and then all of a sudden, within like a blink of the eye, all of a sudden you're at each other's throats and you're sabotaging each other. Well, I mean, the U.S. was, I think, the major protagonist in a lot of that. The CIA.
To be honest, I mean, Athens and Sparta were always at war with each other. I mean, that was a common thing.
Moments,
especially when you involve the Spartans. I mean, they used war as sport. So I mean, it's the nail in the coffin of the Delian League was the Peloponnesian War. So it's that was the nail in the coffin. Athens just ran out of money.
Well, yeah, but also you had
it's very similar of what's happening in America right now. If you go further back, you could see the similarities.
I see the Peloponnesian War kind of like I see the Vietnam War, as just like draining the coffers, and the whole military-industrial complex grew like hyperbolically over the course of the Vietnam War. Well, first the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, which were two insane, unnecessary wars, destroying countries that only wanted to be allies and friends with America. Vietnam has for their constitution, they modeled the Vietnamese constitution of 1946 word for word on the American Declaration of Independence. And the idea was, okay, if Franklin Roosevelt's policies continue, then we have a world of hope and mutual development and win-win cooperation. And Roosevelt and his allies really did believe that and wanted that to be so. But Roosevelt died. We're coming up to the anniversary of what I would say is his murder on April 12th. And the deep state immediately took over. All of his enemies, who he had been at war with for 12 years, immediately took over before his body was cold, and turned America into a perversion of itself. And I sort of see Pericles in a similar sort of way as somebody who emptied the coffers. There was free money for a lot of the people of Greece. They were given a lot of a lot of incentives to just be complacent and docile and happy as Greece went into this what's called the golden age. But I mean, the golden age was an age shaped by wars and looting and building a giant friggin' wall that made the plagues that much worse, that ultimately killed Pericles, as no small irony there. And I sort of see that shift in morals as exactly what happened to America after World War II. And we're paying sort of the piper for it now. But all that to say, Russia in the 80s, literally, I think that asymmetrical warfare and fifth columnists aren't just for America. You had a fair share of these things operating embedded within Russia as well. I think Gorbachev he was somebody who turns out to be a close ally with Maurice Strong and co-writes the Earth Charter with Stephen Rockefeller, Maurice Strong, and Jim O'Neill. Jim McNeil, sorry, Maurice Strong's assistant in 1994. But who the hell is Gorbachev? Like, I mean, this guy opens the floodgates for all of Soros's operations to have full reign in the former Soviet space, especially in Russia. I mean, Soros is having a field day, no resistance at all in Hungary. So I do think that there is collusion both from the Russian side of traitors, but it's not to say that that Russia was always in on it. Like, if you were to ask Brezhnev if he would have done what Gorbachev did, I would say Brezhnev would have said, no bloody way. We're not going to do that. But Brezhnev was dead. Do I think Brezhnev is a good guy? No, I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying he wasn't into sacrificing his society. Same thing for Stalin, who Stalin's supposed to be worse than Hitler, that we're told. But I mean, frankly, when I look at the facts on the ground, the reason why Hitler failed to succeed in that ambition of creating a one world government under a banker's dictatorship was because of the US, China, and Russia primarily putting Russia put the biggest sacrifice of everybody, 25 million died. China lost 10 million of their people in the fight against the Japanese fascists. And, you look at the Trotskyists, in my assessment, the core nexus of the deep state of Russia has always been, since the Bolshevik time and the overthrow of the Romanovs, has been the Trotskyist dynamic within the Bolshevik movement. And Trotsky was sort of always the golden boy, who it's a messy thing. History's sometimes messy. And even though the Bolshevik revolution was, in my assessment, generally a color revolution with Wall Street and London money, it was a bit of a chaotic thing too. Like, they had their ideal of what they wanted, which was Trotsky to be the dictator, kind of like a proto-Pinochet, who would then liberalize the economy under what was known as the new economic plan, or the new economy policy of 1922, which was essentially what Russia was in the 90s. So Russia 1993 with Perestroika was Russia 1923. It's basically, no government intervention, no protectionism, just open up to free markets. And in that context, you have, like, in the 90s, it was George Soros as the big, money bags coming in, buying up Russian industry and creating a local oligarchy beholden to the IMF or the City of London or Wall Street. In the 20s, it was Arm & Hammer. Arm & Hammer was, the George Soros of the 20s, who came in, bought up Russian industry, all of the former state enterprises. Trotsky was the guy who did the most to make it happen. Trotsky also brought in dialectic materialism as a new governing philosophy that was supposed to manage scientific and industrial policy, which is a poison pill, because, the whole idea of dialectic materialism is this deep-seated belief that quantity governs quality. That's one of the core assumptions of dialectic materialism. That is bullshit. Quality. The fact is that all discoveries that are worthwhile have always been made by those who recognize the fact that quality governs quantity. There is quantity and quantization in space-time, as Plato demonstrates in the Timaeus. It's a whole thing, is the investigation of how quantization exists within ones and many, right? So everything exists as a one microphone, but there's many parts that could feasibly be broken down infinitely. But within the one, and between the one and the infinite, there's a quantized many. Right. And the Philebus dialogue is a great place where he explores that in terms of harmonics how you have one string with one harmony, but there's like very specific intervals around which the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do occur at specific consonants. And he does the same thing with the vowels, you know, the A, E, I, O, U. It's like one continuum, but in the you could find these singularities that we can label with we can punctuate with a symbol called a vowel that helps the flow of language occur. So but what is it the quantity of the frequency that determines the quality of the language? No, it's the quality of sound and the quality of ideas that then shape how we interpret or how our minds zero in on the parts, right? And see their relationships. So Trotsky's role, while he was the czar of science and industry for about 4 years in the 1920s, was to impose that quantitative analysis, which, you know, this was at the heart of the fraud of systems analysis and cybernetics theory that emerged during World War II. And when Trotsky was kicked out of Russia, why was he kicked out of Russia? He's kicked out of Russia because he organized a vast network with it. And he was not smart enough to do this himself, but he had handlers from Britain, from the United States, that managed to build up a vast, intricate network in the bureaucracy, the military, the academia of Russia, that had an agenda. It was very compartmentalized, so not many people who were part of the cells of Trotskyists knew what the whole was doing. And the program that Trotsky was leading was to create an alliance with the Japanese fascists, the German Nazis, and ultimately carve up Russia early on and give the different Soviet, areas massive autonomy, which is what the original Lenin Trotsky designed for the Constitution of 1921 was all about. Was you give Ukraine maximum amount of rights to secede. You give all of these local regions, massive amounts of independence. Putin came out attacking this for a reason, and work with the Nazis so that the Soviet Union under Trotsky was going to be a pro-Nazi, pro-fascist part of the world island. And Trotsky got kicked out. The nationalists had ended up organizing around Trotsky's enemy, Stalin, and he got banned. And there was a war that was waged for about more than a decade against these Trotskyist networks that killed one of Stalin's key allies. There was a whole fight that went on. And unfortunately, it was these same assets that became, like in the case of the United States, one of Trotsky's key assistants was a guy named James Burnham. James Burnham was the key guy who was the assistant of Trotsky, who became 6 months before Trotsky is killed in Mexico, right? Burnham denounces Trotsky and says, Comrade Trotsky, I've now read Bertrand Russell, and I am a new disciple of Russell's Principia Mathematica, which is replacing dialectic materialism. Goodbye, dear Trotsky. Good luck. And then Trotsky's killed. Probably not Stalin's people. That's probably actually the Anglo-American intelligence. I think that kills Trotsky because he knows too much. And then what does Burnham do? Burnham becomes the founder of a new sect in America called the neoconservatives. So the entire neoconservatives are set up by these former Trotskyists like Irving Kristol, James Burnham. Oh man, it's a big list. I'm forgetting some of the names that set up Rand Corporation, right? That run Rand, that shapes the entire Cold War. And they build up this thing that people like John F. Kennedy is trying to fight against as this slime mold inside of America. They do the same thing in Russia. After the second Stalin dies in 1954, 2 weeks before he's supposed to meet with Eisenhower to resolve the Cold War, 2 weeks before that meeting happens, Stalin dies. I'm not going to say why Stalin dies. I don't know the details, but it's a weird coincidence. The second he dies, the Trotskyists that were formerly put in gulags by Stalin, because there were several major purges of these assholes, they're rehabilitated under Khrushchev. So you have this massive Trotskyite rehabilitation, a de-Stalinization program where Khrushchev is deployed to psychologically dismantle or sever the idea of the people that anything that happened under Stalin was good and crush that, while at the same time rehabilitating cybernetics, because cybernetics was illegalized under Stalin as a bourgeoisie utilitarian science. It's a science of control, basically. It's the science of command. where you could basically take anything, you break it up into compartmentalized parts as a bureaucracy, whether it's in NATO, the OECD, whether it's in a union, and so that the parts don't know what, like one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and only a small executive understands the whole, and that's the application of cybernetics theory. So that's now brought in. Khrushchev gives a speech saying that this is the new key to managing the Soviet economy in 1960. And all of these fifth columnists that had formerly been purged. Arm & Hammer was banned from Russia the second Trotsky was kicked out. Arm & Hammer was kicked out too. They all of a sudden come back into play, but through these think tanks and through things like the IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, is brought in. And so they're working slowly to subvert Russia from within. You got the same thing under Rand Corps and the Rhodes Scholarship Networks, like the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, subverting America from within. And they're all working together to just dismantle the institution of the nation state itself, that made both Russia and America viable and good. And so when the time comes in 1989, 90, 91, these traitors have taken control of the Russian economy under Gorbachev. Like I said, Soros is brought in. China is under the control of Zhao Ziyang, a Soros operative who's now in charge of the Chinese Communist Party. That's bad. And the difference between China and Russia at this time is because why did China survive the 1980s instead of going the way that Russia went? Well, it's because they kicked out Zhao Ziyang. You know, they had a color revolution attempt in 1989 under the Maidan of Beijing. It was called Tiananmen Square, and it wasn't what we were told. It was not a Chinese government massacre of their people. It was actually a CIA Soros-fueled attempt to bring in Zhao Ziyang as the Trotskyist dictator of China, who was he promised to liberalize the Chinese economy, get rid of national controls, bring in Western, controlling hands of the IMF. That was his promise, and create democracy everywhere. Total fraud. And they basically arrested him, where he rotted and died. His allies were either arrested, or if they did avoid arrest, it was through Operation Yellowbird, through the Hong Kong triads that worked with the CIA and MI6 to bring in a lot of these provocateurs out of China and into Florida, New York, Vancouver, where they remained for the last 35 years as a foreign operation against the Chinese government, running things like Epoch Times, Falun Gong, all of these like other CIA front groups. So it's a whole thing. But there's this other. That's why, again, it's a value for me to not look at the world shaped by nation states, but by oligarchical asymmetrical operations and intelligence agencies that use synthetic cults, like the cult of Delphi or Apollo at Delphi, that just changed its form but used the same techniques all the way up through the Scottish Rite Freemasonry networks that run the FBI. It's so valuable. It's so useful to just look at things that way. I rambled a lot. I'm sorry.
It's all good. I could go on with more with you when it comes to like 15-minute cities, carbon footprint, and all this nonsense. But I'm going to pass you on to Grace. Thank you so much, Matt.
Hey, man, no problem.
Thank you, John. Matt, I just want to bring 3 things from a viewer that he wanted you to please share what you know. So he said, ask Matthew what he thinks about JFK Jr. deciding to run for president. And then ask him about CBDC, which you mentioned a little bit already, and also ask you about Trump's America's First. And then you can end it.
Yeah. Well, good for Bobby Kennedy Jr. I mean, leadership, that's for sure. I think, Bobby Kennedy is really, I support that. I was a little disappointed on some of his foreign policy stances because I'm a real foreign policy buff. I really, that's a high value for me. And I know, his views on Russia are a little weak. He does seem to be very proud of his son, who's fighting as a mercenary with Ukrainians against Russia. I was a bit surprised to hear about that. I think he needs to wake up a little bit on some of these foreign policy issues. I think he doesn't see the fight the way I think he should regarding the resistance of China, Russia, India, the multipolar alliance. I think he sees that as just another variety of the fraud of the Great Reset. I don't think he doesn't recognize any authentic fight for humanity there. So I do hope that he can be educated, and I think he's a good, authentic, honest person. So good, authentic, honest people can always learn. They're, you know, but he needs I think some support there. On banking and finance, I don't really know what his views are on banking and finance. I firmly support his views on medical mandates and medical dictatorships. I mean, his approach to resisting that is very good. But again, somebody should tell me maybe you guys know what are his views on national banking, Glass-Steagall, economic reform? Like, does he have a policy stance on these things?
I think the question is not really the CBDC is not about him, what's his view, but in general, what you think about it, what you learn from Alex Craner, etc.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, Alex and I are very, very much on the same page. The CBDC idea is part and parcel of a broader digital revolution that is part of the fourth industrial revolution doctrine. And there's a fight around what that means exactly. Like, you know, it was understood not just by futurists of the 1950s and 60s, but anybody looking at the general trajectory of human civilization's relationship with technology and science could kind of see in varying degrees, as again, early as the 50s and 60s, that the growth of automation, which has been something humans have been doing anyway with the Industrial Revolution. You know, there's the first Industrial Revolution, the utilization of machines to take the place of human labor, which was generally a good thing. You know, you are now all of a sudden free to liberate a society dependent upon a slave labor-based economy was now able to get itself off of the drug of slavery by having a machine do the work of 100 laborers, whereby then the laborers would be then free to start utilizing mind work instead of physical work to define their identities, which then created a much greater cultural level of improvement. So that's good. But the problem there is if you have oligarchs managing an industrial policy, you'll get the sort of thing we read about in Charles Dickens, the Tale of Two Cities, or Oliver Swift, which is basically child exploitation, you know, extracting human labor for the sake of turning work into profit with no consideration for the minds or culture of the people. So everything can be corrupted. Everything. A hammer can kill your neighbor so that you could steal their stuff, or it can build your house. You know, it's all about the intention. So there was an understanding that the orientation of computing technology, digital computers, automation was going to result at a certain point in a form of a crisis, due to the fact that many of the repetitive manual jobs that were done by people could be done by computers. And again, that's not a big surprise, but it could be done very efficiently. So, you know, we're at a point now where we're sort of slamming into that transition point whereby the technology is advanced enough that many things that we currently take for granted could be done by computers or by machines animated by some algorithm that, you know, does something repetitive. It doesn't mean that human beings will ever be irrelevant, because at the end of the day, there's always new things that we're going to encounter that no computer has experienced. There's always new discoveries that have to be made at all times to overcome the limits to growth that no computer can make, because computers can only use deductive or inductive reasoning. You know, they can't use more than that. So it's that more than that allows human beings to make the discoveries, which is why holes in the universe are more than the sum of their parts. A computer can just deal with holes that are the sum of their parts by an assumption. That the reality is not that. I am not the simple sum total of the cells and atoms making up my body, right? There's something more that makes me look in the mirror and say, hi, I'm Matthew. I have this soul. I have these metaphysical components, right? So computers don't do that. They're very material. It's kind of like dialectic materialism or cybernet. It's the same thing. It's computers are wired to interpret quantity as governing quality. So you always need the human element driving that. So today, I think that CBDCs are being brought online primarily by the Davos crowd to be a part of the thing we had discussed. You know, the mass behavioral modification of humanity under a depopulated zoo that would eat bugs, no longer eat meats or things that cause methane, and get our injections of whatever genetic modification we're supposed to put into our bodies. That's one ideology governing one idea of the central bank digital currencies that will be brought online when the current banking system blows out, and the current banking system will blow out. It can do nothing but blow out. So we will get a new banking system. That's going to happen. But when you hear the idea of digital currencies, like I said, in Eurasia being discussed, or the idea of fourth industrial revolution, it's not look at what the ideas, designs, policies, and intentions are regarding the application of these things. Like, for example, AI, machine learning, automation, 3D printing. These are components of it. China is just in the midst of building. They've built 5 of the 10 largest hydroelectric dams in the world in the past 20 years. They've also built about 38,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. The US has hardly any. Canada has none. Now, right now, one of the largest dams is a 380 meter high dam being built up in China. There's no human element to it. It's halfway done. It's being built up through 3D printing, like going through layers of the dam being built up with like automated machines packing in the cement going through, right? And then another layer is added. And it's being organized or coordinated, very, very complex process by certain algorithms that are a form of AI. The outcome of having this dam built is going to be massive flood controls, huge irrigation, doubling of food output within the farming regions in the adjacent zones around that zone, and I think something like 8 gigawatts of energy for industry and civilian use. That's a very different application of the idea of the fourth industrial revolution compared to those same technologies being used in the West, which is primarily to create systems of control and command over dumbed down, depopulated people who are supposed to have less energy, less food. We're blowing up our dams in California. They've spent $500 million in California blowing up demolishing 4 hydroelectric dams built up in the 60s in order to free the deserts and bring back the natural desert ecosystems, which should never have been green. You're going to kill thousands of farmers, right? And you're going to create a massive scarcity, which will justify more depopulation in the West. Whereas in China, the application is to create more abundance. So again, whether a currency is shaped by gold or by plastic or shoelaces, I don't care. It's not the plastic or the shoelaces or the gold or the silver that gives value to a currency. It's what are you doing as a society that then infuses value into whether it's a digital currency, whether it's tied to wheat, whatever. But it's, are you doing things that are in the objective reality that benefits people and creates abundance and overcomes scarcity? Or are you doing things that are creating scarcity, shutting down the lives of people and nations? Which one of those two? So I think that the central bank digital currency thing has to be evaluated from that framework. Otherwise, yeah, I'm generally against it to the degree that I see it being animated by a death cult.
You want to make a comment on Trump's America's First?
Yeah, that's
just
good.
For a brief
yeah,
moment.
I generally support Trump.
So thank you very much. And I'd like to, I guess, everyone's quoting, including you putting this in writing, President Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, the famous one, because I like that too. And he says, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted, only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. So, Matthew, do you want to say more about where people can connect with you? And I thank you so much again.
Yeah, that's a good quote. Yeah, well, they can go to, as you pointed out, the CanadianPatriot.org is my main Canadian geopolitical website. And the books that my wife and I have published are all very easy to find on there as either paperbacks that can unfortunately only be purchased on Amazon as of this moment. They just make it so damn easy, and or PDF. And otherwise, Substack is another way you can support the work, follow our writings. There's free and paid upgrades. And Rising Tide Foundation, as you pointed out at the beginning, is a sort of more educational, cultural website, which we're trying to sort of experiment with to see if we can create the basis of a more healthy approach to education. We got a bunch of projects on different observatory projects we're working on right now and other things. So that's risingtidefoundation.net. And we host weekly seminars every Sunday. So if people do want to listen in or receive the invitation, either get the paid upgrade to our Substacks or send us an email to info@risingtidefoundation.net, and we'll put you on the mailing list for that.
And to all of our viewers and supporters, and you can always check each and every one of us outlet in BitChute, Ray Coughlan, for John Katsavos, and individuals who are with us. And it will be like, we try to be in every platform that hasn't censored us. So just keep trying, we'll be there. Okay, thank you so much, and take care of yourselves. Have a good evening, good night, whatever you share. Take care.
All right, bye, guys.